Welcome back to Talk Tickers, the show where we help you understand earnings calls, without having to listen to all the corporate jargon.
Yeah, we break it down, make it simple, and hopefully a little bit fun.
Exactly. So today we're diving into Mosaic Company's Q4 2024 report, and they're a pretty big player in the fertilizer space, specifically phosphate and potash.
Right, and this call was it was interesting to say the least.
Yeah, there were definitely some surprises. So let's get right into it. Mosaic reported a net income of $169 million and an adjusted EBITDA of $594 million for Q4.
Not bad, especially considering all the headwinds they've been facing, like those hurricanes that hit their production facilities.
Yeah, those hurricanes were no joke. But despite that, they're saying these strong numbers are mainly thanks to two things, phosphate and potash.
And it's really interesting to see how those two segments are performing on the phosphate side. Prices are holding strong, and so are the stripping margins.
Stripping margins, you mean like taking off layers?
Well, not exactly. It's basically the profit they make from producing phosphate fertilizer. And those margins are looking good because globally supply is tight and demand is high.
Okay, so phosphate is booming.
Okay.
Got it. What about potash, though? I thought prices for that were kind of low.
They were, and that's what makes their potash performance so intriguing. They're attributing it to their Esther Hazy mine in Canada, which is actually a world's largest potash mine.
Wow, the world's largest. That's got to be huge.
It is, and because of its size, they can produce potash really efficiently, which keeps costs down.
So Esther Hazy is their secret weapon.
Kind of, it's a major cash generator for them, and get this, they're actually investing in expanding production there, even with the possibility of those Canadian tariffs coming up.
Wait, tariffs? What tariffs?
There's been talk about Canada potentially imposing tariffs, which could obviously impact Mosaic since their biggest potash mine is there.
Right, makes sense. But they're still expanding production even with that hanging over their heads.
Yeah, it seems like they're pretty confident that even if the tariffs do happen, potash prices will stay affordable enough that it won't destroy demand.
Interesting. So they're not too worried about those tariffs, but what about all the other potential supply disruptions we've been hearing about? Like what happens if the war in Ukraine ends or those sanctions on Belarus get lifted? Wouldn't that flood the market with potash?
That's a really good question, and they actually address that in the call. Their take is that even if those things do happen, the impact on global potash supply will be limited.
Okay, so they're feeling pretty good about potash, but let's circle back to phosphate for a second. They did mention some challenges there, right?
They did. While the phosphate market is strong, they're still working on getting their U.S. production back up to speed after those hurricanes, Helene and Milton, which really messed things up in Q4.
Yeah, those hurricanes were brutal.
Yeah.
What's their plan to get things back on track?
Well, they're putting their money where their mouth is. They're going to speed up their capital spending to improve the reliability of their facilities in Florida and Louisiana.
So like upgrades and repairs.
Exactly. And they're aiming to have it all done by mid-2025.
Makes sense. Those high phosphate prices probably make those investments pretty attractive. But didn't they have some issues with ammonia supply too? That's like a key ingredient for phosphate fertilizer, right?
You're absolutely right. That was a major concern. But they've managed to secure long-term ammonia supply at competitive rates, so that threat's neutralized for now.
Okay, so phosphate is a mixed bag, strong market, but some operational hurdles to overcome. What else jumped out at you from this call?
The performance in Brazil was pretty interesting despite some market and credit challenges down there. Their business in Brazil is actually doing really well. Strong margins, cost reductions, the whole shebang. It seems like Brazil is a real bright spot for them right now.
Brazil. That's not usually the first place that comes to mind when you think about fertilizer.
I know, right? But Brazil is actually a huge agricultural powerhouse, and Mosaic seems to be really capitalizing on that. They're even building a new blending plant down there to give them more flexibility in the market.
A new blending plant. So they're going all in on Brazil, it seems like. But hold on, before we get too deep into that, I want to shift gears and talk about their overall strategy. They mentioned something about analyzing their portfolio and making some changes.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get strategic. They're taking a hard look at all their assets, figuring out which ones are underperforming, and then deciding how to move that capital around for better returns. It's like spring cleaning for their business.
I like that analogy, spring cleaning for a multi-billion-dollar company. So what are some examples of this portfolio shakeup?
Well, they already sold off their Potters Gaminas site in Brazil, and then there's the Modern transaction, which was a pretty smart move. They ended up with a gain of $522 million from that deal, and there's potential for even more down the road. They're also exploring options for their Carlsbad potash mine in New Mexico. Could be another sale in the works.
Wow. They're not messing around. It sounds like they're laser focused on streamlining their operations and squeezing out as much shareholder value as possible.
They are, and it's not just about cutting costs and selling things off. They're also investing in growth areas like their Mosaic Biosciences segment.
Biosciences, what's that all about?
It's all about developing innovative agricultural products, things like micronutrients and biostimulants that help farmers get more out of their crops. It's a way for them to diversify beyond just basic fertilizers.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. Optimize the core business and invest in new opportunities. Makes sense. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out, but before we start making any predictions, let's take a closer look at their outlook for the global agricultural market.
Sounds good. Let's dive into that.
Okay, so what's their take on the overall ag market?
Well,
You know what? Actually, let's save that for after a quick break. We'll be right back.
sounds good.
Okay, so we're back and ready to dig into Mosaic's outlook for the global agricultural market.
Yeah, let's see what they're predicting.
So what's their take on the overall ag market?
Well, they're actually pretty optimistic. They're forecasting a strong year for agricultural commodities in 2025, especially for major crops like corn and soybeans.
Okay, so good news for farmers. But how does that translate into good news for Mosaic?
When crop prices rise, farmers usually have more money to spend on things like fertilizer. So Mosaic's betting that those higher crop prices will keep the demand for phosphate strong.
Makes sense. More money for farmers means more money for fertilizer. But wait, isn't phosphate also used in other things? Like I think batteries use phosphate, right?
That's right. The demand for phosphate is actually growing outside of traditional agriculture, too. It's being used more and more in battery production, which is another potential growth driver for Mosaic.
So we've got rising crop prices and the whole battery thing pushing up demand. But what about supply? Are they expecting any relief on that front?
Not really. They're saying that there's very little new phosphate production coming online, and China is still restricting exports, so that supply crunch is likely to continue, meaning high prices, and those nice stripping margins are probably going to stick around at least for a while.
So it's a classic supply and demand story. Tight supply and rising demand equals good times for Mosaic, at least on the phosphate side. What about potash? What are they saying about that market?
They're expecting strong potash demand, too, particularly from key markets like Malaysia, Indonesia, China, and of course, Brazil.
Brazil again, huh? They really seem to have a thing for Brazil, but hold on, didn't we talk about some potential supply issues with potash earlier?
Yeah, we did. And actually, they're saying those supply constraints are probably going to get even worse. Major Chinese producers are cutting back. There are maintenance outages happening at Belaruskali and Uralkali, and there's still a ton of uncertainty around production from Laos.
So same story as phosphate, tight supply, strong demand. Mosaic's in a pretty good spot if these predictions actually pan out.
It does look like it could be a strong year for them, both operationally and financially. But of course, every investment thesis has its risks.
Right, of course. So let's play devil's advocate for a second. What could go wrong? What are some potential risks or challenges that could throw a wrench in Mosaic's plans?
Well, for one thing, they're heavily reliant on the global agricultural market, which, as we all know, can be pretty volatile and unpredictable.
Yeah, things like weather patterns, crop yields, even geopolitical events can have a huge impact on commodity prices. And ultimately, Mosaic's profitability is tied to those prices.
Exactly. And while phosphate and potash prices are looking good right now, there's no guarantee that they'll stay that way. A sudden shift in the market could easily wipe out those gains.
So commodity price volatility, that's a big one. What else?
Well, there's also execution risk to consider. Remember, they're planning to ramp up capital spending to fix up their phosphate facilities and boost potash production. And big projects like that are always vulnerable to delays, cost overruns, and, unexpected technical challenges.
True big projects rarely go exactly according to plan. Anything else we should be thinking about?
Well, we can't forget about competition. Mosaic's not the only player in the fertilizer game. There are other companies out there, and any new entrants or capacity expansions by those competitors could put pressure on prices and margins.
Right. Competition's always a factor, especially in a commodity-driven industry. What about the regulatory environment? Any concerns there?
Definitely fertilizer production is heavily regulated, and any changes to those regulations could impact their operations and drive up their costs. There's a lot of focus on sustainability these days, and Mosaic needs to stay ahead of the curve on that front.
Good point. So we've got commodity price volatility, execution, risk competition, and regulatory hurdles. All valid points. Sounds like investors need to weigh these risks carefully against the potential rewards before jumping on the Mosaic bandwagon.
It's always a balancing act. That's what makes investing so interesting, right?
Absolutely. Now, before we get too serious, it's time for the segment our listeners have been waiting for. This is not financial advice.
The part of the show where we let our imaginations run wild and brainstorm some outrageously plausible trade ideas.
And remember, folks, this is just for fun. We're not financial advisors, and these are purely hypothetical scenarios.
Don't come blame us if these trades go belly up.
All right, let's spin the wheel of speculation, given Mosaic's big push into biosciences. How about a play on that trend?
Ooh, I like where you're going with this. What if we go long Mosaic and at the same time short a traditional agricultural chemical company that's been slow to adapt to this whole biosciences thing, a classic disruptor versus disrupted play.
I like it, betting on the future of agriculture.
Sure.
Mosaic's biosciences segment is still pretty small, but if it takes off, it could be a game changer.
Mm-hmm.
But for our listeners who are feeling a little more adventurous, how would a contrarian play based on those Canadian potash tariffs?
Now, you're talking if those tariffs actually do get imposed, we could see a short-term dip in Mosaic stock price, but if they're right and the demand destruction is minimal, that dip could be a buying opportunity.
That's a bold move
Yeah.
for sure, but hey, no risk, no reward, right? Of course, this all depends on Mosaic being able to handle those tariffs effectively. Maybe we could even make it even more complex and make it a basket trade. Long Mosaic, short Canadian potash producers who are more exposed to the tariffs, and then throw in a long position on a non-Canadian potash producer who might actually benefit from the supply disruption.
Whoa, now we're getting fancy, a multi-layered international potash play. This is not financial advice is all about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Remember, everyone, these are just speculative ideas. Do your own research, consider your risk tolerance, and never invest more than you can afford to lose. We'd love to hear your thoughts, though. What other wild but plausible trade ideas are you cooking up? Share them with us on social media, and let's keep this conversation going.
And join us next week for another deep dive into the world of earnings calls.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for tuning in to Talk Tickers, where we break down earnings calls so you don't have to.
Until next time, stay curious, and remember, this is not financial advice.
Wow, so many crazy trade ideas floating around out there.
Yeah, but we got to wrap things up eventually.
True. So, any final thoughts on Mosaic before we say goodbye?
Well, I think the main takeaway here is that Mosaic is making some really big moves, to set themselves up for growth in this global ag market that's changing so fast. They're optimizing their portfolio, investing in new stuff, and navigating all this geopolitical craziness.
Yeah, it's not like they're just sitting back and enjoying the high commodity prices. They're actually shaping their own future, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and as with any company, there are definitely risks and challenges to keep in mind.
Right, of course. But what's interesting to me is how Mosaic is approaching those challenges. They're not afraid to make tough decisions. They're taking calculated risks, and they're definitely thinking long term.
It's almost like they're playing a game of chess, trying to anticipate what their opponents are going to do and strategically positioning themselves for the best possible outcome.
That's a great way to put it. And it'll be
Right.
fascinating to see how their game plan plays out in the next few months and years.
Yeah, it's a fluid situation, and there are a lot of things that could impact their success. But one thing's for sure, Mosaic is a company to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. They're a major player in a crucial industry, and their decisions have a real impact on the global food supply chain. It's a story that goes way beyond just the numbers.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of another deep dive.
Thanks for joining us on Talk Tickers, the show that breaks down earnings calls so you don't have to.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, and remember, this is not financial advice.